Good afternoon, everyone. We will just wait for a couple more people to get into the room and join with their audio. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Emory Community Conversation on Belonging and Inclusive Community. My name is Marche Simpson, and I'm the Director of Diversity and Inclusion for Alumni Engagement within Emory Alumni Association. Emory is working to engage our community by not only the year our students become alumni, but also their chosen career field or industry, but also their individual identity, including race, ethnicity, nationality, gender, sexuality, religion, and all the pieces that make you you. Emory Community Conversations is a series of engagement opportunities centered on the dimensions of identity. This series serves as a foundation for individuals in the Emory community seeking knowledge and/or looking to explore identity and its connection to racial justice, social justice, and human rights. Our goal for this programming is to activate the Emory community to be more thoughtful about what equity and inclusion looks like for marginalized identities and take an individual action in the many spaces we occupy. So join us every first Tuesday of the month as we navigate upcoming topics, including the journey to allyship and the Black Box, a dive into race, ethnicity, and culture. Speaking of individual action, today is Giving Tuesday, and Emory is supporting our students by removing one stressor from their lives, food insecurity. Between academic years 2016-2017 and 2018-2019, Student Intervention Services saw an 80% increase in the number of students requesting assistance with food-related needs. I will share the link in the chat for anyone who would like to give to this very important cause. Two pieces of housekeeping to note. This presentation is being recorded and will be sent to everyone who registered. Second, please type your questions in the questions section of the platform, and we will get to as many questions as possible following the presentation or this conversation. For increased comfort, you may also submit questions anonymously. And now, allow me to introduce our guest. Today, we are joined by our friends from the Emory Belonging and Community Justice Working Group, also referred to as the BCJ. The working group includes the Center for Women, the Office of LGBT Life, the Office for Race, and Social Justice Education. Malcolm Robinson is one of the assistant directors in the Office for Racial and Cultural Engagement, RACE, focusing primarily on Black student programs and initiatives. He also helps manage the Emory Black Student Union and supervises the space's student staff. Malcolm initially joined the Emory community as an undergraduate student in the class of 2015. He is currently pursuing a PhD in educational leadership from Mercer University while he continues his work within Emory campus life. Thank you for joining us, Malcolm. Chanel Kraft Tanner serves as the Director of Center for Women at Emory. As the Director of Center for Women, Chanel provides executive leadership for the Women's Center and develops and sustains partnerships across the university to establish a shared vision for the CWE and lead its implementation. Chanel also provides strategic guidance and support across the Emory enterprise to make the university a better place for women and all students. Chanel holds a PhD in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies from Emory University, where she completed a dissertation entitled Beyond the Bars, using US Third World Feminism to reconstruct constructions of carcerality in hip hop. Additionally, she holds an MA in Women's Studies from Georgia State University and a BA in Government and Politics from the University of Maryland, College Park. Chanel is also a member of the internationally recognized Crump Feminist Collective, where she brings expertise in the areas of hip hop feminism, US Third World feminism, Black feminism, cultural studies, and critical prison studies to read popular culture. Thank you for joining us, Chanel. Jackie Veliz is program coordinator in the Office of LGBT Life. Jackie oversees the office's Safe Space program, supervises federal work study student staff, advises undergraduate student organizations, and supports and manages major office events. Before Jackie's role in the Office of LGBT Life, Jackie was the program coordinator at LaGuardia Community College LGBTQIA Safe Zone Hub, where Jackie was able to initiate a safe space program, create the campus's first lavender graduation, and advocate for LGBTQ plus inclusion across city colleges in New York City on the CUNY LGBTQIA plus Service Council. Jackie's academic career began at LaGuardia Community College before transferring and earning a Bachelor's of Arts and degree in creative writing from Emory University in 2018. As a recent addition to the team, Jackie would like to extend a big welcome to any folks at Emory who are looking for support, kindness, and laughter. Jackie states, "I'm always eager to hear about the hobbies you love, the music you're listening to, and the idea you're pondering, so feel free to send me an email or stop by the office to chat." Of course, after you have your COVID test. Thank you all for joining me to be here, and let's jump right in. Our first question is around belonging and inclusive community. So when we use the term belonging, we're referring to an individual being part of a group and their sense of being essential or respected group of a member of that group. Inclusive communities provides a sense of belonging by nurturing that individual's needs for connections with others. How do we as individuals and as community members go about providing a sense of belonging? That can go to anyone who would like to answer.
I can lead off if you want.
Yeah.
Um, so I think as I'll answer it from the individual perspective because I think that this is a question that a lot of people began pondering over the summer as we were dealing with a national reckoning around race. Is how do I make people feel like they belong? What is the work that I could be doing? And so I think a lot of this is well, what is the work you can stop doing? And this kind of folds into what we talk about a lot, at least in the student affairs side of things, is microaggression. And those are those little daily behavioral or verbal things that you may be saying to someone in a marginalized group or doing, and it could be intentional or non-intentional, that make us feel like, well, I'm not normal or I don't belong here. And so talk to any member of a marginalized group and they'll share with you things that they were told, like, you're not like the other Black girls, you're not loud, or you're different than other people who are a part of your group, or little things that may be said in a classroom or in the hallway. And I think many of us do that if we hold a privileged identity it without really recognizing that. So I think that's the first place that people can start, is really doing a self inventory on what are things that you may be saying that are creating this idea that there is a norm, that therefore people can feel like they don't belong to. That will go a long way towards creating a sense of belonging for others.
I'll hop in as well. Thank you, Chanel. Before I share what my perspective is, I think it is important for us to kind of frame like where we're coming from. So I always like to just give a caveat. I don't consider myself an expert. Marche did introduce me as someone who works in the Office for Race. I don't consider myself an expert on race, but that's what my professional focus is, and that's a passion area of mine. So, we're all coming from our own respective places. So just hopefully the audience can keep that in mind as we respond. But this question really made me think about kind of the distinction between belonging and inclusion. And so for me, just kind of the way that I keep those two phrases in mind is belonging is feeling like you are welcome somewhere, and then inclusion makes you feel like you are wanted somewhere. So I think about what inclusive communities look like and some of the individual things that you can do to kind of share that message that you are intending to create an inclusive space. Language is a very important and very accessible way to kind of self-inventory, like Chanel was saying. So what language are you using to make people feel like they're welcome and wanted? Or what language are you using that makes people feel the exact opposite? So we talk about inclusive language a lot in BCJ, and there are a lot of different examples of what that looks like. One that I can give right now is person first language, right? So, people who have disabilities of whatever kind, really making sure that you are putting person first language out there when you're referring to them. So a person with a disability instead of this disabled person. And some of those things, they seem like they're very small, but they make such a large impact in terms of making people feel like, okay, this is a space for me, or I do feel normal, like Chanel said, in this space. And so there are tons of examples of different ways to take an inventory of your language and make it a little bit more inclusive, just so people around you feel safer and they feel like they belong. So I would offer that up to the group, that's just one really easy thing you can start to look at right now.
And with that, like this idea of taking a self-inventory is also practicing how to challenge your assumptions and what assumptions you're coming into a space with and why, and how are you boxing people into those spaces. And then that person actively has to fight against the assumption that you've given them, rather than entering a space with a knowledge of where people could be coming from. So I don't want to say that any of us are free from assumptions, but we're challenging them. We're challenging ourselves, challenging where ideas come from.
Jackie, I like the point that you made there, but I have a question as a follow-up to Chanel. Something that you mentioned is ask any person in a marginalized group and they will tell you. And I know a lot of times right now we see on social media and we see, over the summer, that a lot of people are saying, I don't want to do that emotional work of having to answer questions when there are things that you can Google and so forth. So when we're saying to ask a person as part of a marginalized community, is that in practice? And how do we go about having those conversations with people that we consider to be close, either through working together as colleagues or so forth?
Yeah, to be real clear, do not go up to members of a marginalized group and ask. I meant that in like a general, like ask anybody. do not do that. People are really, really exhausted from having to do that kind of labor. And there are so many people who have already willingly done it. There are documentaries, there are novels, there are, people who have shared what that's like. And so to especially if it's a random person. Now, I do believe friendship is a way of life. And so, if it's a friend and maybe y'all have the kind of relationship where, you can ask that, but don't come up to me and ask that kind of question. And so, yeah, I agree. I think that there are, marginalized groups are not monolithic. There are people who, like myself, who do feel like an educator. That's the role that I play. I really don't have a problem recommending books, having difficult conversations with people, and really doing the work to bring about more allies. But that doesn't mean that everyone else who holds my identity feels that way or that they should do that work. And so I think that we all play different roles. We're all comfortable doing different things. And so the role I play is as an educator, hence why I work at Emory. But that is not, something that we should expect or require folks to do that very heavy bridge building work all the time.
Okay, I appreciate that. And Jackie, to your point of saying that this idea of making assumptions and boxing people in, we talk about that often. And my question to you is, how do you go to someone, and this is around asking questions again, how do we go about engaging individuals who are colleagues or someone who we consider a friend or so forth, and trying to become familiar with them and their identity, about asking them about those things? What comfort level do you think there needs to be so that we're not boxing them in, but for me to go to someone and not assume because they have short hair that they are LGBT plus, or if they look a certain way that I assume that they're transgender and they may be queer or somewhere around there. So how do we go about asking people in a respectable way about their identity to get to know them better and to kind of break that ice?
I like this question, Marche, because it's tricky. I think it's tricky,
Mhm.
at least, because on one hand, my immediate response is, why do you need to know that information about their identity? Like, what is that going to do in terms of how you are interacting or treating this person? Because there are a lot of different ways that you can treat someone with grace and humility and in an equitable way without having to know specifically disclose this part of your identity to me so that I can treat you better or treat you differently. But on the other hand, I understand the intention behind that, which is you want to honor someone's very unique identity, right? And you want to make sure holistically that you are interacting with them in a way that speaks to your intention of being inclusive or creating a sense of belonging. So I talk about this with some of the students that I work with, and usually what I tell them is that um, two things. One, usually that information comes up in your relationship with that person, especially if you're talking about being very familiar or comfortable with them. At some point, that disclosure is going to happen. And some of the ways you might be able to facilitate that, to my second point, is maybe starting with being vulnerable yourself, right? So sharing those parts of yourself and then sending that message that this is a space where you can share parts of who you are with me as a person. I'm not going to push you to do it, but the space is open and available. Um, and so that's usually just been my approach. And that's what I've encouraged some of the students that I've worked with to do, is just to be patient for that disclosure if it's something that you are authentically waiting for. And then just being reciprocal with that, being vulnerable about those parts of yourself as well, and letting that kind of lead the way with how you're forming those relationships with colleagues. So hopefully that answered at least one part of your question.
Yeah, I would also make sure that the intent isn't to be transactional, that you're going to get this information and doesn't actually change the relationship that you have with the person. So consider, what would this add to our relationship? And then consider why haven't they told you already? Is there something that I'm doing and maybe I got to work on that first before receiving this information?
And Jackie, I'll ask this specifically to you because I see that on your name, you have your pronouns there, right? We talk often because when we were meeting in physical spaces and we were allowed to be on campus, a lot of alumni and students and visitors came into Miller Ward Alumni House, and you introduce people to other people as they enter the building or so forth. And pronouns was a big thing for our office, was that if an alum came to campus and they went by them and theirs, it's making it clear that these are this person's pronouns. And so please make sure that you introduce them that way. And so when you're at an event and I want to introduce Malcolm to someone and I'm just meeting you, Malcolm, and wanting to be respectful of them, going about and asking, I think some people have some difficulty with wanting to say he and him or she and her versus this is Malcolm. I would like to introduce you to this person. This is Malcolm, and using, like you said, that person first language versus using pronouns and in some way, sometimes using the wrong pronouns and offending someone. And I think what I've heard from some people is that once they've done that, it's really hard for them to come back from it. And they feel like they've excluded this person and then they're spending the rest of their time with this person, not being able to get past that. So yeah. But I do think it's to your point earlier, Malcolm, that using that first person and just using someone's name is as simple as you don't have to know their identity and they don't have to disclose that information. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, my advice would be, start using the person's name and also practice. Go ahead and practice on your own time. Not necessarily using they, them pronouns for a specific individual, but practicing using they, them pronouns for everyone all the time, no matter their identity, because it's not, we're trying to get to a place where we're using gender inclusive language as a starting place rather than as a reaction to new information. And so it is that practice bit and that preparation. So we don't want to get reactive to new people or be reactive to new people.
I also want to just add, if you mess up, because you will, we all do, to not make a huge deal out of it. I mean, I always just think about that episode of Saved by the Bell where where Jesse kept following Lisa around because she was so apologetic about finding out her family owned slaves, right? And so the white girl is following the black girl all around for like a week. Like, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. It's so awkward. I think you just say, "Oh, my bad." Correct yourself and try better moving forward. Or if someone else corrects you, like they actually go by they or he, or say, "Oh, I'm sorry," change your language and keep it moving. I think, being hung up on it can actually just make it a bigger deal than it needs to be. And I'm not trying to say that pronouns are not a big deal. They're a huge deal, but that heaviness people feel around getting it wrong, and then not knowing what, maybe assume you are going to get it wrong. My children call me the wrong. I've been daddy so many times over the last 8 years with my daughter. It doesn't make sense, but we do that, right? Like, as humans, we call people the wrong names. So it's possible that you're going to call someone the wrong pronouns. Just move on from it. That's what I would add.
Yeah, and I think when you're doing that over apologizing, think about who are you actually centering in that moment, because oftentimes you're centering your own desire for forgiveness. That you're like, forgive me as soon as possible. So if I apologize more aggressively, then it can really hit home that I am sorry, rather than then taking the time to think about what are other ways that I can show you respect and honor you, than to harass you with apologies, if you will.
I really like that, Jackie. Thank you. And thank you for that response as well, Chanel. Um, Another question we have are, what are some examples we often see people ignore, that we should be more thoughtful about when trying to be inclusive? So we've talked about pronouns, and we talk about like race, identity, and self-worth. Are there other places that we're just being exclusive, that we're probably ignoring, that we're not aware of?
I can go ahead, Jackie. Yeah.
I was gonna say, like, not listening to the community. So I think folks can get caught up in like, I'm reading all the books, I'm doing all the workshops, I'm listening to all the podcasts, so I have arrived. I think it's an acknowledgement that you are going to keep working. You are never going to arrive completely. And that gives you the room to then make progress, rather than keeping you at this place where you're like, I'm never going to get it wrong anymore, and I can be an advocate, or I can be the voice of all marginalized communities because I've read all the books.
I'll add to that. I think that oftentimes people maybe subconsciously assume that their views are, those dominant views are, the only views, or the only way of being and doing in the world, or the right way, which is even more troubling. And so I think that gets ignored a lot, is that self work that you need to do. So if you're really trying to be inclusive, it is really having a deep commitment to difference and diversity in a way that is saying that this is situating yourself, understanding how you came to the understanding that you have about the world, what things influence that, and knowing that that is just one way, and that other people are coming with an entirely different set of experiences around their identity, around their culture, and that is welcome, that is okay. You may not get it, you may not understand it, but to create a truly inclusive community, that we have to account for that difference and create space for people to bring that difference to the forefront.
One of the things Chanel's comment just made me think of is somewhat similar, but it's something I experienced a lot this summer, just with the Black Lives Matter movement being at the forefront of media in general. Was just a lot of people who I don't have like intimate conversations with reaching out to me and saying, this must be such a difficult time for you as a Black person, as a Black man. If there's anything you ever want to talk about in terms of race, like, let me know. I think there's a way to be mindful of people's different experiences without pandering to them. Because I mean, even for me, as someone who, I talk about race all the time, it's what I do for a living. That was just those were very disarming messages for me to get in a very just traumatic time in the summer. And it didn't feel authentic at all. Like it made me feel less included, which I know was probably the opposite intention of what that was supposed to do. But kind of just playing into like being very hyper aware of a moment and not necessarily like a movement as it relates to identity politics, I think is.
I think we lost Malcolm for a second.
I think that we did lose Malcolm for a second, but I appreciate everything that he was saying. So I hope we didn't miss like the icing on the cake that was gonna bring it all together. But as we wait for Malcolm, oh, here we go. We lost you for a second, Malcolm.
Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. What was the last thing that you heard?
The last thing that we heard was about it being a part of the moment and not the movement.
Oh yeah, that was my last golden nugget. So let's just leave it there.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for that. And I think a lot of times and I think Jackie with your events, and Malcolm can appreciate this too when talking about events, and even Chanel, something that I am talking about often when it comes to religion is the fact that we make room a lot of times for identity when it comes to sexuality and gender and race and ethnicity, but we ignore sometimes people's religion. And so we have a number of student and alumni networks that are based around religion, like our Muslim networks, our Hindu networks, and so forth. And as much as we make room for things like Jewish holidays and so forth, we're not making the same room for things like Ramadan, right? And so with Ramadan being so earlier for the last few years and how we support the Muslim group and what that looks like, looking at our events and saying that, oh, we have Muslim alumni that are coming back. And so I need to be mindful to have some place for them to pray and to be thoughtful that we have a large Muslim community. And so serving pork at an event, like things like that, I think go beyond someone showing up to a space and feeling like they're not welcome because you didn't think about those things or look at a calendar to see that I am honoring or experiencing Ramadan right now, or I can't think of the actual word. But I think some of those things are important as well. Our next question, and I think we have a question in Q&A. So the question says, with DIC being more and more popular these days, how do you keep the authenticity and sincerity of the message and not fall into a checking of the box attitude?
I'm not sure what DIC is.
I think
Whoever,
work, maybe.
What'd you say? Diversity and inclusion, maybe?
yeah.
How do you keep sincerity?
But yeah, so if we say diversity and inclusion, I'm not sure what the C stands for, but with diversity and inclusion being more and more popular these days, how do you keep the authenticity and sincerity of the message and not fall into checking of the box attitude?
I mean, sometimes it's helpful to think of an example. So I'm thinking about what you just talked about, Marche, with trying to be inclusive in terms of the food, even that we provide in an event. And I think you just think about, from a programming perspective, yes, diversity and inclusion. I think that it is difficult and it can get overwhelming when you're trying to be inclusive, to think about all the different identities that you want to account for. And so for me, it's really about just, because it's about belonging and trying to make sure that people feel welcomed, it doesn't feel like I'm just checking a box, like, you know, with the sustainability checklist, like, did we make sure that this is reusable? It doesn't feel like that, because this is about people and trying our best to create an experience in which they feel like they can belong, even if it's down to like, well, we got to at least make sure we have something on the menu that people can eat. So we need fruit, like bare minimum. We need to have some fruit on the menu, because you can fill up on that nonetheless. And so always just thinking about what this may feel like to show up at an event and have nothing to eat as a host. That feels terrible. That feels terrible. And unfortunately, you know, I'm even thinking about vegans, right? Like, they had to think about eating before they got there, because the assumption is that there wouldn't be something there for them. I think like now we're in a place where we try to create even our menus down to a place where everyone can have at least something, some bite to eat. And we do the best that we can, but there are times, you know, so also having that grace and forgiveness with yourself, because there are times where people may come up and say, you know what, I appreciated that, but you know, I actually the cheese touched the fruit and I'm severely lactose, so I couldn't have it. And so being willing to, it's like, what do you do when you get that feedback that you weren't as inclusive as you intended to be? I think that is super important, more so important than the plan you try to make around inclusivity, are the elasticity upon which you operate. And do, if it were easy, then everyone would do it. It's so much easier to just say, get the chicken tenders and this and that, and not really think about it. And you know, I'm going with the metaphor of the food, but this is also important for how we build our space and how we create other programs. The easy thing to do is to just do it, like in a way that is like for able-bodied, you know, people who look like you or who reflect the identities of the people in the room that is planning the event. The harder thing to do is that checking over and over again and being open to making a mistake and getting that feedback. That is not easy feedback. It's never easy feedback, but what is our strategy during our debrief to think about, you know what, that we really didn't think about the fact that this is uphill and there is someone who, you know, needed a wheelchair. We didn't think about that. So being able to reflect and make changes going forward is important.
I just want to add also that Chanel, I hope that y'all can hear it in Chanel's work and our work, that we're asking ourselves a lot of questions. Every time we produce any sort of program, it is all of us being each other's devil's advocate. We're like, but what about this? And then who's gonna invite these people? And how are you gonna let them in? Does the elevator work? Do we have, like, I remember we had a grad happy hour for our grad students, grad and professional students. And something we also thought about was like, do we have drinks that look like alcoholic drinks that folks can also pour into their cup so that they feel included, that they don't feel like they're left out of the conversation and then have to speak to why they're not drinking. And so one is, getting ready to ask all the questions you need to ask, and then, or want to ask, have to ask, and then also looking forward to the feedback. We love feedback and we're excited about it because we're like, great, we're gonna do so much better the next time.
And I think what you're pointing to, Jackie, is super important. And it's, you know, one of the things that makes belonging and community justice so great is the collectivity. So I think you get away from that checking of the box thing when you're doing things in community and when that community is diverse, because people can speak on behalf of their own experiences of exclusion or you know, their own identities. But it is that doing the questioning together and not feeling like you are the diversity person who has to have all the answers. We have a really incredible team who's super knowledgeable, and we've created a space, a working environment in which we can do that kind of work together.
And I know that, you know, not everyone is lucky enough to be part of a BCJ type staff, but I think one of the things that you can recreate is just accountability partners. I really feel like we serve as that for each other. there are a lot of times, just depending on what's going on during the year, what's going on in our life, where it would be easier to just say, let's just do this program to say that we did this diversity program. But there is just this unspoken rule among us as accountability partners that we are going to, these programs are serious, they matter, and they need to be implemented with quality, and not just done for the sake of them being done, because that's a waste of our time, and we're not adding anything to anyone's lives. And then the other thing, I think it's really helpful to have some type of anchor. This work is very personal to all of us. I think that it's beyond just professional interest. I mean, we are marginalized people after 5 p.m. every day. So this work means more than just, our 40 hours a week at work. This is, we're trying to create better worlds for ourselves, for people who look like us, and people who don't look like us. So I think that helps us as a group of people.
Yeah.
That's that's actually a perfect segue into my next question, because I've talked to alumni, and this is specific to the LGBT plus community. And it's outside of work, like you said, we're all marginalized people, and these things affect us outside of our regular 9-to-5s, right? And so I've talked to a few alumni who have said, like, their children have come out, or people in their family have come out, and so forth. And they're wanting to support them, but don't know how, right? And like, where do I start? And so how do we provide that same sense of belonging that we've been so focused on in the workplace, also bring that home as it pertains to our families, and not knowing how to support them in like that first step?
This is how to support LGBTQ children in your,
or just, it could be LGBTQ, it could be that someone is in an interracial relationship and that's something very new for their family, but how do you approach this sense of belonging and inclusivity within families outside of your normal 9-to-5 workspace? But I feel like a lot of times we approach this conversation as it pertains to our workspaces.
I think specifically for the LGBTQ community is being honest with what you don't know, and then communicating that lack of knowledge, and then doing the work to go figure out what it is that you don't know, rather than putting that work on the person. And then also empowering the person to set their boundaries. So if they're giving you the grace and patience of working with you through these new identities, through these new terms and culture, if you will, then also giving them the space to set the boundary of, that is enough, I'm tired today, or like, I can't do this. And giving someone the space to set their own boundaries is a great expression of love.
I think that we are in an incredible time, because there are so many online communities, and not just for people who hold those identities, but for the people who love them. And so I would suggest connecting with resources online where there are other families who are asking those same questions. How do I support them? Or I messed this up. Now, what do I do? I think that is a huge tool that families should take advantage of. And but also know, also there are novels, there are all kinds of television shows, there are documentaries. There's just so many, there's a wealth of resources out there that families can engage in together, or just on your own, so that you know more. But also remembering that the experience of your loved one is unique. So don't think that because you watched Laverne Cox's Disclosure documentary that then you can map that onto your own trans child's experiences. So creating a space where it's like, I know a little more, but I'm also open to you being the expert on your life and your identity and how that matters for you. And so I think that, even down to like, I have a friend whose child is in the furry community. And so we found resources online that were supporting family of children who are furry. Like it's so specific now. And there's Instagram hashtags you can follow and Facebook groups and subreddits that it's a really wonderful time, I think, to be, partnered with or parenting or just in community with people that you want to do a better job of making them feel they belong.
And then not centering your discomfort, if there's some level or type of disclosure, right? Because that's not the focus point in that moment. So, I mean, recognize that maybe this is new to you, this is new information. You're not at a place right now where you have the tools to really navigate that, but that doesn't need to be the center of the discussion. It's really, how can I support this person in what they've just shared with me? And there are communities for dealing with your own discomfort outside of that, right? And that doesn't need to take the forefront of the conversation. Someone wants to know what a furry refers to, Chanel.
They're people who wear like animal, like they kind of dress like teddy bears of various sorts. And so my first introduction was actually like a Law and Order SVU episode, but that was sexual based, but there's so much more all encompassing. Like it's actually more children who do it than older people, but it is Googleable. It is, there, even the resources, we were shocked to find parenting resources, and also really excited to find them, because it gave us a place to be thinking about, how we support each other in this.
Another thing too, I would ask is, or I would say is, ask the person, like, how can I support you? Like, if you are a parent of a queer child, saying like, what do you need from me today? And maybe you ask that every day. Maybe you also ask like, hey, I think if someone also is coming out to you, maybe coming out to you as non-binary or trans, also asking every day, like, hey, do these pronouns still work for you? Would you like me to call you by your name today? And just giving the person room to be flexible and explore yourself. I think that can be really scary for queer people, is that they have to make that decision immediately so that they can communicate to someone else, so that they can at least feel seen a little bit more, and then they feel scared that they are now stuck in an identity. So giving folks room to grow.
I really appreciate that, Jackie, because I've heard that too, as far as people who that constant check-in of, does this still fit? And how would you like me to change that, or change, like, is there anything better that I can do? Have, like, asking those questions up front and not waiting for the person to come to you with those changes, but to show that you're very much interested. That goes into my next question, and it's, how do we help individuals ensure that their unique attributes and traits and skills and identities are valued, and that they don't feel it necessary to leave part of themselves at this door, whether it's in virtual spaces or in workspaces, classrooms, or even in families. When we're going to, I mean, we're not traveling a lot right now, but when we're going to families' homes or what have you, not having to dress a particular way because Aunt such and such might say something. So what do you all have for those individuals who are really don't know how to quite fully embrace their identity yet?
I think fully embracing your identity takes, honestly, a level of privilege that everyone doesn't necessarily have. So if I think about the workplace, I remember a time where beards were not, and I'm not just saying this because you have a beard now, Malcolm. I actually didn't notice that when I when I was thinking of the example, but where that wasn't an okay thing for men to wear beards to work, and where that changes when men in leadership began wearing beards. And that allowed more people to feel like they could do that without suffering consequences. Because I think we have to be real that there are consequences for showing up as your authentic self. I remember talking to my friends, my Black women friends who were lawyers, not even that long ago, but we're in the natural community, we were really like taking off, where they were like, but I can't show up at work natural. I have to wear my hair slicked back in a bun, because when I show up in front of this older white male judge, he may not see anything but my afro, and I need him to pay attention to what I'm saying here. So those are things that are going through people's minds. Like, is it safe for me to show up, or will my career take a hit, or will I be, you know, as a young director, I'm constantly thinking about my youthfulness and how I might show up in a way that may not be taken seriously. And so I may make decisions around how I style my hair, what I wear, what earrings I put in, depending on the meeting, right? Depending on the day to day, I may make different choices around respectability politics, so that I could be respected. And so there's a way that, like, we know the culture is all bull, but that I can't be marginalized and shift the culture. I think that that's true in families too, which is why the cool auntie role is super important. Like, having that auntie show up as her authentic self and take that heat from grandma saying, when you gonna put a perm in that thing or whatever, like take that heat. The younger cousins and stuff are looking at that. Your younger siblings are looking at that. I looked at that, and it gave permission for me to at least have like, well, there's somebody in my family who has done this already. But and this isn't to say that people shouldn't try. I just know that I wasn't that brave, and that it mattered to me to see, you know, Black women in leadership show up with box braids. That let me know, oh, we doing box braids here. I could do box braids, or bright orange acrylic nails. Okay, you know, and so I do think that there's a way that when you get into a position of power and influence, that you showing up as your authentic self, when you know who gonna check me, boo, like, you know, that the stakes are lower, or that the consequences are lower for you, that you can be carving out opportunity for people underneath you. And that is how the culture shifts in spaces.
I appreciate it, Chanel. And I will say, I definitely had the experience of entering a space and being asked, how long is your hair going to be like that? When I wore it out natural for the first time. Like, is this, and the question was, how long is it going to be like that? Or is this permanent? And I was like, the way that it grows out of my head, or like, what are you asking me specifically? So most times, depending on where I have to show up, you will find me in a high bun that continues to disappear in this virtual.
I mean, the other thing is we're in Zoom, right? And so we're talking about people showing up as their authentic selves. I don't think you want to see what's behind some of these muted videos some days of the week, especially as Black women, right? It's like, nah, I don't think y'all really want authentic me today. I think today you will get the cute picture in the profile. So yeah, I just think that there are consequences to it, and people make those choices for a lot of different reasons.
But I do also appreciate your point about having allies within your family, because I will say that I did have that in one of my aunts, my cool aunt Cheryl, who like took time to all let us know that, like, oh, hey, how's my beautiful niece? And let me know that all the things that I was doing was great, and that the sacrifices that I was making weren't unseen or unnoticed. And so I hadn't thought about that until you just said it, that we can have allies in our own families, and have that sense of exclusion, or sense of not belonging in our own families, and what that looks like. And having that one person show up for you makes it a little bit easier to show up to Thanksgiving or Christmas, or to not avoid those holidays where you know that someone's going to show up and just maybe have the potential to ruin your whole holiday. And so I appreciate that. I think that we have a question. So we're asked, should we try to use first person language for people of color? For example, instead of saying a Black woman, a woman of Black culture, this doesn't seem as accepted, but should we try for all the same reasons we do this for other situations?
I think this is a good question. I'm glad it was asked. I'm not a Black woman, but I would say the answer to this question is no. first person language in this particular scenario is not what would be accepted. I think that we've all kind of danced around this point about this work being very lifelong. And I think this question kind of illustrates that because, the conversation about how to identify someone in a particular community is always evolving in different communities. I know at one point when I was learning about different communities with disabilities, there was this conversation about, you know, don't refer to this community as deaf people, but people who, experience deafness or what have you. And then, I read an article maybe a couple months later that was like, this community is reclaiming this term deaf and, they want to be referred to in that way. And so, that gets to the point of this being lifelong work. It's not a workshop. It's not a badge to get where you say, I figured out how to refer to this person with their identities. It's really tuning into what is this conversation? I know for the past 2 years, in the Office for Race, when we posted Latinx Heritage Month in September and October, that's usually part of the conversation is the utility and the meaning behind the term Latinx. Is that still something that's acceptable? And every year we've had that conversation, it's been a different takeaway each year. And so there is no one size fits all way to be inclusive. So I hate that that's the answer is, it depends, but it really does depend on the situation, the community, and what have you.
Yeah, I think it's important to pay attention to how communities are defining themselves, to Malcolm's point, and that may change. And so I doubt you hear Black women refer to themselves of women as a part of who are part of Black culture. So that would be odd because that's not language that we've heard Black women use to define themselves. So most Black women I know identify as Black women, and where the conversation is now is whether or not you capitalize the B, right? So that shifts too with time. um and I think about this a lot too. As a director of the Center for Women, we've had long conversations about our name and whether or not that in of itself might be exclusionary, and what do we do to make sure that trans women know that this is a space for them, that gender non-binary folks also know that this is a place that if they want to be in and see themselves as part of, that they can be there. How do we do that but also hold on to the historical importance of the name and to the fact that women as a category are still, marginalized and oppressed? So again, it's back to those, having the conversations, and the process of it is what's important, and the elasticity, flexibility to change as communities change. And if someone corrects you and says, actually, instead of people with disabilities, we'd like to be referred to as disabled people, and know that that may change person to person. And so also giving people the opportunity to define themselves for themselves.
Yeah, my advice would be to use the language that that individual is using to describe themselves and then mirror that.
That's great. Thank you, everyone. Another question we have in the Q&A box is, on the opposite end of the age perspective, how does one deal with the ageism aimed at the older staff member, particularly in a university setting?
Yeah, I think that is a tough one, and you're asking a bunch of young millennials how we deal with that. So we deal with it on the other end, right? Like all the conversation of millennials, they're ruining everything, right? And so I think, one thing we talked about within our respective identity spaces is creating more space for intergenerationality. And I think that so much could be had if there were more opportunities in university settings for older people and younger people to be together in community. There's so much value there. It's why I stayed in the Black church, because it's one of the only places where I can see babies and great grandmas in community together. And so there's lots of generations on a university campus, but we don't always get together. You may see a professor in a classroom full of young people, but really institutionalizing opportunities for that to happen, I think will help to combat some of the ageism, because some of it is just we don't know each other very well. And so we have these stereotypes around even our generation and how we do and why we do. And, and the internet doesn't help because it's constant generation wars. But a part of that is because we don't have those natural spaces for us to engage. So, but yes, ageism is a problem.
Thank you, Chanel. And our next question is, how do we stay up to date on community language and norms? Any resources or sources you can recommend?
Goodness gracious. Personally, I feel like I'm always behind on the lingo, just in general. But I listen. I think that that's important. I listen, and when people, say something that I'm not familiar with, I may ask if I feel comfortable to ask, or just take a little note and look that up. So I remember when we started moving towards language of cis, to identify, to help us really think about our identity in terms of cis or trans. And I remember being like, what? How do you spell that? S-I, but just listening and hearing that, like, oh, that was a shift that I hadn't heard before, right? And so is it Native American? Is it American Indian? So listening to how communities are defining themselves and being super attentive of that, and then doing a little bit of background research to see like what are people saying. But resources, I would say probably around particular communities, you would see more resources. So what is the media organization for GLAAD? Is it GLAAD? They have really great resource pages around language and stuff for the LGBTQ community, but I can't think of resources for others.
And I would say it's as easy as a Google search. I find myself often, when someone says something in a conversation, making note of it, and going back and researching it, and sometimes going into a rabbit hole because you find out something new and you're like, how could I have not known that this change happened? And I mean, and things change from day to day. Like Jackie said earlier, is that some of these terms and the language that we use changes day to day, and it could be on an individual level, on a group level. And so Google is your friend. And I think that's always a great resource. But like Chanel said, GLAAD is a great one for LGBT+. I can't say that I know one for race identities in general. So yeah, but I saw, Jackie, that you unmuted yourself. Did you have something to say?
Yeah, I was going to say, along with Google, something that Instagram has been a really great platform for like activism, but also really like great snapshots of like quick information that can really start a conversation for you. So I would advise also just looking up hashtags. So maybe you search up like Latinx and see what comes from there. And then from there, that's a landing spot for you to go elsewhere, follow some accounts. There are a ton of social media, social justice accounts now on Instagram that are very helpful.
I think it's also just important to not treat issues of diversity as being so unique to the point where you don't even try, right? Like, I can't keep up with it. Meanwhile, we keep up with all the other ways language has changed and what we call things has changed. And there are things around COVID-19, new words and vocabulary that have come into fruition, or, into prominence that we weren't using a year ago, 9 months ago, even. So I think it's important when it comes to these, the way people identify, the way communities identify, that we don't dismiss it as like, I can't keep up with it, but we can do it when it comes to technology or, health issue, anything like that we're able to keep up with. I think you just want to do that work like you would with anything else. We know what LOL means. We didn't know that 10 years ago, didn't exist. So I think that that's just important to just put in there.
Yeah, that was a great reminder. Thank you.
Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so happy that you accepted this invitation to have this conversation. For everyone viewing, thank you for joining us as well. If you would like to continue the conversation, we can do that on Emory Civic Dinners, which is civicdinners.com/Emory. And I hope that you'll also join us for our next conversation on Tuesday, January 5th on the journey to allyship. Again, thank you to our panelists and friends in the BCJ, and for everyone viewing. Thank you so much and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Bye, everyone.